Hello everybody, and welcome to, a complete contradiction really of many of the things that I've said. That might be a little bit extreme, but basically I've said many times before on this channel that I think a lot of good photography advice centers around the idea that you need to slow down, you need to take your time with your compositions, with what you want to take photos of, with assessing a scene, with your settings, all that kind of stuff to ensure that you get the best result. However, that's not always possible. Like if you're walking down the road and you see a meteor about to fall from the sky, you can't exactly take your time. Like get your camera out your bag and set up your tripod and your filters and play around with your settings and then go, ready. Meteors don't typically hang around for you. So you need to be on it. And actually for me, lots of my favorite photos have been taken in a split second. Not in a split second, of a split second. Like if I hadn't taken the photo at that exact time, I wouldn't have got the photo. So today what I thought I'd do is go through some settings, some camera settings, as well as some ways of thinking and approaches that I use to help make sure that I get those kinds of photos, the kinds of photos that are fleeting moments, as opposed to big chunks of time where you can take your time in order to get the best photo. That's what I thought I'd do today. So it's not really a contradiction, but sort of is. Before I start though, let me show you how my yesterday afternoon went. So basically I spent it printing. All of the prints from the sale are shipped now. So they're on their way to you. This is what one of the images is supposed to look like. I think you can see that. And this is how it was coming out on my printer. Way too oversaturated and just generally a bit nasty. 3 hours. They were coming out like that and I couldn't figure it out. Absolutely racking my brains until I worked out that my computer was set to printing on standard paper, not photo paper. 3 hours. Anyway, taking photos fast. Now the first thing I'd like to talk about is anticipation, as you probably guessed. Now lots of people, I think, when they're in a scene whereby there's like a fleeting moment that you want to take a photo of, a lot of people see that moment as it's happening rather than before it's happening. And a lot of time, they might look at a scene and go, oh, that would have been a good photo, but I've missed it. And they sort of give up on that photo there and then, which kind of makes sense because the moment's happening, they can't possibly take a photo of that moment. What I try to do if I see something like that is figure out, is there a photo to be had in 10 seconds time? So for example, this photo of this sled and the town of Umanak in the background in Greenland, this is basically a good example of that because I'd seen the sled before it had gone past me and the background was basically just an ice desert and that looked like a very good photo, a very interesting photo, but I wasn't ready for it. But rather than just give up on the photo, I tracked the path of the sled and worked out where it would be by the time I was ready to take the photo. And it turned out that it was going to have the town or the island as a backdrop. If you haven't seen that Greenland video, that's an island and the sea is just frozen. And yeah, so I got my settings ready and waited for the sled to cross into the path of my photo and therefore got that photo. And if I'd just given up and thought I'd missed the shot, then obviously I wouldn't have got that. So a lot of the time what I'm trying to do is guess what's going to happen in 10, 15 seconds time, what I'm going to see in 50 yards time, what's going to happen a little bit into the future, basically. And I think that often is the difference between new photographers, people who are kind of seeing things just in the moment and missing shots because they're only seeing them when they're happening, and more experienced photographers who can kind of see a little bit into the future and therefore plan and get themselves ready in a few seconds between noticing what might happen and it actually happening. And that's a huge deal, and it's responsible for me getting lots of the photos that have become my favorite photos. And when you practice anticipation, you get very good at it. Like for example, I know that somebody is about to knock on my front door. Got a new jacket. Very nice. A bit big though, I think. I always go for large because I like to think that I'm a size large, but actually I'm pretty much always a medium. Too hot. Yeah, so anticipation is not necessarily an easy thing to teach, but the premise of it is basically trying to figure out what's going to happen in a few seconds' time. And if you see, for example, a car that you might like to take a photo of, if you're not ready to take a photo of the car where you see it, work out where it's going to be in the next few seconds and try and mentally compose what that's going to look like when the car is in a new position. If it looks like it might be a photo, set up for that shot and wait for the car to come into shot. It's quite difficult using fictitious examples, so I don't know if it's making much sense. Basically, the other day, I went to a lake in Wales at Llynelsi where I made a video a couple of months back. It was much better this time. There was no wind. Obviously, there was autumnal trees. It was beautiful. And I was hoping to demonstrate this there, but I sort of forgot that you don't really get many fleeting moments there. It's very much the sort of place where you can go and take your time with photos. So that didn't really work. I was sort of hoping there'd be like swooping swans or something that would have worked quite well, but no. So camera settings is clearly also a huge part of this, not just anticipation. You also need to have your camera set up to be able to use it quickly. Now I use the Panasonic Lumix G9, as many of you will know. This video is sponsored by Lumix, and this is a very, very quick camera, and a camera that I've learnt to use very quickly over the sort of 18 months or so, maybe 2 years now actually. Just under 2 years that I've been using it. And in the past year of that time-ish, I've been using custom profiles an awful lot more. And I have a particular custom profile set up for this quick shooting when I've only got a couple of seconds from recognizing that I want to take a shot to taking the shot. So I flick the dial to C2. That's the custom profile that I have set up for this stuff. And there are a few settings here that I'll go through which enable me to take these photos quickly. So in this custom profile, first up is shutter speed, which is set to 2/100ths of a second. And the reason for that is that that is just about fast enough for pretty much all of the focal lengths that I use to get sharp shots, thanks in big part to the image stabilization, both in the lenses that I use and in the body itself, the 5-axis dual image stabilization. And shooting from 8mm, so 16mm full frame equivalent, all the way through to 200mm full frame equivalent, I'm pretty confident that in any conditions, I can get a sharp shot at a 2/100th of a second, unless it's super windy and I'm shooting at longer focal lengths, in which case I'll just take the lens hood off and take precautions to try and make sure that I'm steadier. So that's the first thing. I also have my aperture set to f4, and the reason for that is twofold really. It's still quite bright, which means that my shutter speed can stay fairly quick without having to raise the ISO too much. But it's also stopped down a little bit just to make sure that it performs optimally. And at f4, unless I've got a really, really deep scene, then most of the stuff, particularly my whole subject typically, is going to be in focus. And when you're shooting in really fast moving settings, the last thing you want is to get home and realize you've missed a shot because your subject is out of focus. That would just be, well, that would be horrible. And then for ISO, I'm in auto ISO. So to make sure that I get a half decent exposure, I can't shoot fully manually because obviously conditions change all the time. And therefore I need the camera to judge ISO to make sure that the exposure turns out sensibly, which might not be the case if I was shooting somewhere where the light was low, for example. So yeah, ISO is just set to auto, and I find with this camera that works pretty well. I'm also set up to exposure bracket, which I do an awful lot with this camera anyway, but particularly when I'm shooting fast, I exposure bracket. And the reason for that is twofold. I can get 3 photos very quickly. That was 3 photos. And obviously those 3 photos will be different exposures, all set apart by a stop, which means that when I get home, I can quickly choose the best one. They're all going to be pretty much exactly the same photo, even if the subject is moving quick, because they're taken over such a short space of time. It also means obviously that I don't need to worry too much about the exposure because basically I have a choice of exposures. So I pretty much always bracket. Now lots of people I think assume that I bracket because I want to merge those images in post-production, which I do sometimes, but the vast majority of the time, the reason that I'm bracketing is just so that I have more choice over which exposures I pick when I get home. Sometimes I'll be out in the field at a scene that I think I want to slightly overexpose, and then when I get home and look at the pictures in the cold light of day, or night, depending when I'm editing, I change my mind. And if I've got 3 different files at 3 different exposures, then I can just do that more easily. I mean, with modern sensors, you can play around with the exposure no end if you're shooting in RAW, really. But it's just nice to have those 3 files to make sure that I don't need to make huge changes all the time when I want to adjust the exposure. Focus, I use single point autofocus, and I don't use continuous focus, because what I typically do is focus, back button focus, so I'll just leave the single point in the middle of the screen, and then when I'm in focus, I keep my thumb pressed down and I'll recompose. And then I can take the 3 bracketed photos without the camera refocusing for the second 2. And that's pretty much it, I think. Auto white balance, but I'm shooting in RAW, so even if the camera gets the white balance wrong, it doesn't matter. I can change it in post. And actually, naturally, it goes without saying that when I'm anticipating what I'm going to be taking photos of, that's a good time to try and make decisions on lenses, rather than when you actually see what you want to take a photo of and then deciding to change lenses, because typically that's a process that takes more than a couple of seconds. In my experience, I'm not the fastest lens changer. So yeah, that's pretty much that. And what that group of settings means is that I can go from turning my camera on to taking a photo in literally, I don't know, a second and a half, without having to really worry at all about my settings, because I know that more often than not, they're going to get me a good result without me having to even consider them. And that basically is the reason that I've got this custom profile set up, is when I see what's going to be a photo opportunity in like 3 seconds time. Oh, and also actually, I can't discount this Peak Design capture plate holder. I don't really know what you'd call it. But basically, if you've not seen one of these before, this sits on one of my camera straps, and then the camera just slots into it like that. So my camera just sits on my bag strap. Now, lots of people have asked me about this, and they comment saying, oh my word, I wouldn't trust this. This is very well made. I've never had a single problem with it. And any of the people that I speak to who got these have also never had problems with it. So it's a really, really good piece of kit. It means your camera is always to hand. And this has definitely been responsible for getting me some more photos that I wouldn't have otherwise got if my camera was in my bag, or even just dangling around me on a strap, which I used to hate, particularly climbing mountains and scrambling up on all fours, and you've got a camera sort of just dangling around. It's horrible. This has solved that. So a very good piece of kit. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. And if you've got any questions on anything that I've just said, there's a good chance I've not made complete sense. So do let me know in the comments, and I'll do my best to get back to you. Also, if you have any suggestions of how people or me can quicken up their workflow in situations like the ones I've spoken about, then do let me know. I'll be very interested to hear those. Thank you very much to Lumix for sponsoring this video and for making the G9. I love it more as the days go by. And yeah, this is a very good quick camera if you're in the market for a good quick camera. And finally, as I said at the start, most good photography advice does center around this idea of taking photos more slowly. And certainly when you're just starting out in photography, it pays to kind of think through your process and not rush things. But there are also times when you can't really do that. And yeah, I just find that the things I've spoken about today help mitigate those times and make sure that you get good shots in those times. I'm banging on about the same stuff. Thank you very much for watching. I'm so pleased I sorted out my printer problem. I'll see you next time.